Oh, sorry. Hello, good morning. This is a test recording. I would like to introduce you to my online classes by first of all telling you about who I am, what I can do, and how we are going to study together. This is a totally new experience. I know most of us have not been used to this mode of delivery of instructions, and therefore you might find it a little bit difficult. But what I want to say is that whether there are hiccups here and there, whether I don't get certain things right, this is just a pilot lesson. And what will follow later, I believe, will be an improved version of what you're having now. Otherwise, I would like to welcome all of you to my classes. Let's learn together, let's interact, and let's improve our knowledge of everything that we want to acquaint ourselves with in life. I know you'd like to know what kind of teacher I am because you'll not be attending my classes. You cannot afford to take your time to listen to or to download my classes if my delivery is not effective, if my mode of instruction is not something you're used to. So I believe the first thing I would really want to do is to introduce myself to let you know what kind of person I am, what kind of teacher I am, who is your tutor online. Well, I am a passionate teacher and an educator. I have been a teacher of the English language for over 20 years. Due to my interest in perfecting both my spoken and written skills, I am a voracious reader, a prolific writer, and a keen listener to the BBC. I am offering myself as a potential online teacher as a result of my realization that there is a deep gap between the demand for highly proficient English language tutors and the local need for the services. I am a highly responsive and innovative teacher gifted with the ability to communicate eloquently. I am also able to engage my students and retain their attention for considerably long periods due to the interactive nature of my teaching. Um, I often pay particular attention to the specific needs of my students so that I can adjust my mode of instruction and delivery to suit their unique individual challenges. That is precisely who I am. I'll ensure that whenever we are conducting classes online, I will be careful not to present the materials I have in a way that you do not understand because from my classroom experience, which spans over 20 years of successful hands-on dealing with first-time learners of the English language, I have realized that sometimes the language class does not produce effectiveness due to the manner of interaction between the teacher and the students. You know, language is spoken and therefore it is best learned through interactions. I therefore wish to expand my tutoring horizons by being your virtual teacher. Now, besides being a teacher, I'm a proficient copywriter with undiluted confidence in my research skills and intuition for producing content that grabs attention, helps people, and builds trust. That is a very important point. If there is no trust between you and me, if you don't trust that what I'm going to present will benefit you, then you're not going to be my student. But I really want you to be my student. I want you to get the best out of me so that you can later on say, hey, we had an online teacher who really gave us the best of our time. So as your online tutor, I'll think of creative ways of improving your learning experience by bringing initiative, drive, and creativity into your lessons. I'm very passionate about teaching, having been a tutor of the English language for the last 25 years. From my many years of practical teaching, I have evolved a teaching style that is compelling and thought-provoking because I'm gifted with excellent English or Swahili languages speaking and writing skills whose basis is an insightful and exceptional power of communicating ideas succinctly. My top priority will be to create an interactive learning environment in which there is a strong feeling of community and a high sense of professionalism. By applying creative and engaging approaches infused with a warm and friendly tone, I'll strive to ensure that my students get the best results from all the available collaborative tools like Google Docs, Google Classroom, YouTube, Trello, Slack, Zoom, Hangout, and others that will be convenient to you. Lastly, I'll make every effort to be a good time manager, apart from being flexible and open to all sorts of feedback. To achieve your learning objectives, I'll observe the philosophy of being a guide on the side and not a sage on the stage. Welcome. Now, today, I'd like us to begin by learning about a subject that is really, really close to my heart. I am a published poet, a self-published poet. I've written a collection of romantic love poems, and therefore I would like our lessons today to be about poetry. This week, I would like us to look at some of the most important elements of poetry by examining the following. A. What is poetry? Of course, I know you've heard about poetry oftentimes in schools, at home, during shows, and you might wonder why I want to introduce poetry again. But let me tell you, it is precisely because people fear poetry. People don't understand poetry. They don't know what poetry is. And so, if I illustrate what poetry is, perhaps that will give you a better opportunity to understand poetry. So, one, this week, let us find out what is poetry, and then two, what makes poetry different from prose. Poetry and prose are different, both in style, in writing, and even in the way we digest them. So, we're going to find out about what makes poetry different from prose. Number C, how does poetry communicate to the reader? And number D, what are the stylistic features or devices that poetry uses to communicate? If we can understand all these four components, that is, what is poetry, how is it different from prose, how does poetry communicate, and what are the stylistic features or devices that poetry uses to communicate, then we are going to find it pretty easy to understand poetry. Now, many students believe that poetry is such a complicated subject. From experience, I know that most students dread poetry because they assume poets deliberately write in a complicated way in order not to be understood, or because they do not want to be understood. But that is hardly or rarely the case. In actual sense, the eloquence of poetry, the beauty of the language poetry uses, and the meaning of a poem is the easiest thing to understand. It doesn't require the intensity of a rocket scientist to understand what a poet is saying. Most students approach poetry with that fixed mentality that this is a difficult subject, therefore I have to really prepare myself. I have to psych myself mentally in order to understand this poem. That is a mistake. Approach poetry as you would approach any other subject. Learning how to read and interpret poetry is like learning a new language. You need new tools and strategies, different from what you may already be using to read prose to arrive at the meaning of a poem. That is always the most difficult thing. That is the fear that prevents most people from touching poetry. They think that they cannot know what a poem means. The poet deliberately wants to hide the meaning and that kind of stuff. Well, as long as you can understand the surface meaning of a poem, you can use the tools, if you understand them, that a poet uses in order to understand the deeper meaning of the poem. Understanding poetry, I would say, is like a journey of exploration and discovery in which you need equipment like maps, compasses, binoculars, flashlights, and even a penknife. You might wonder, why am I making this kind of analogy? It is very important because poetry, when you encounter poetry for the first time, it's like you are going to a strange territory, a strange place where you've never been to before, a place where you cannot tell the direction, where you are totally disoriented. And for many travelers, especially explorers, whenever they are going out on expeditions, one thing they often do is to ensure that they are equipped with things that can assist them to identify where they are, to tell the direction, and to find out their way around the terrain in which they find themselves. Now, this is equally similar to poetry. When you meet a poem for the first time, when you're reading it for the very first time, it is not easy to immediately understand what the poet is talking about. But if you arm yourselves with the tools that helps you to understand poetry, then you can easily unravel, you can easily discover what the poet is talking about. So, in order to navigate the now landscape of poetry, we need certain tools. However, these tools are different from the tools that an explorer uses. Instead of a compass, we might need something like personification. Instead of a penknife, we might talk of imagery. Instead of a map, we might talk of symbolism in poetry. Now, that will guide you in unraveling and understanding the meaning of a poem. So, in poetry, these tools like personification, like imagery, like simile, like symbolism, like rhyme and rhythm are things that are very, very important in helping you to understand. These are the lovely spices, the sugar coating, if you like, that makes poetry delicious and interesting to read. Actually, if you make a habit of reading more and more poems, the more you read, the more you will discover that poetry is not a mysterious thing, that poetry is actually fun to read and pretty exciting. Now, let us go back to the beginning of where I started from. What is poetry? How do you define poetry? Now, different people have different definitions for poetry, but generally, poetry is a type of literature or artistic writing based on the interplay of words and rhythm. We've got four keywords in that definition. One, it is a type of literature, or two, it is an artistic type of writing, and this artistic kind of writing is based on the interplay of words and rhythm. Rhythm has something to do with music, and therefore I can say that poetry is music. So when you listen, if you listen to the words used in a particular song, it is the same way you can read words used in a particular poem. In other words, the building blocks of poetry are the words used and the rhythmic or the musical effect achieved. I hope you're getting that. The building blocks of poetry are the words used and the rhythmic or the musical effect achieved. By carefully choosing and arranging words in a special way, a poet attempts to stir or to evoke a reader's emotions and imagination in order to convey meaning. Poetry has a lot to do with your emotions. Poetry has a lot to do with your imaginations. So if you cannot apply your emotions, if you cannot apply your imaginations in poetry, you might as well not try reading poetry, because poetry has a lot to do with imagination. That is why one of the most important stylistic features used in poetry is imagery. And as you well know, we have two types of imagery. I'm coming to that slightly later, that we have two types of imagery, that is similes and metaphors. We are going to look at what similes do, what metaphors are, how you can identify them in a poem, etc. But the most important thing I want you to know here is that when words are arranged in a special way, the poet is simply trying to evoke, to stir your emotions and imagination so that he or she can convey his or her meaning. Now, in poetry, words are strung or put together to form sounds, images, and ideas that might be too complex or abstract to describe directly with prosaic writing. I'll repeat that again. In poetry, words are strung or are put together to form sounds, images, and ideas that might be too complex or abstract. Something abstract is something that has no form, something that you cannot identify specifically, say that this is that or that. So when poets want to express some abstract ideas or some abstract things, like I could say love is an abstract notion, you can never absolutely define it, fear, pain, and such kind of thing. When poets want to describe such things, they use writing that directly is opposed to the prosaic type of writing. Poets compress a lot of meaning by using as few words as possible. They don't say very little using many words. They say a lot using very, very few words. Now, poetry can be classified in different types. There are three main kinds of poetry, namely narrative poems, dramatic poems, and lyrical poems. Those are the three main categories, but that is not all. Apart from narrative poems, dramatic poems, and lyrical poems, other common forms of poetry include odes, limericks, haiku. Haiku is a Japanese type of poetry. Sonnets. Sonnets were majorly done by Shakespeare, who is one of the greatest poets who ever lived or who shall ever have been when this world finally goes. And sestina. Sestina are a kind of French poetry. This is to do with the French culture. Now, there are other types. Even nursery lullabies are forms of poems. There are so many nursery lullabies with rhymes, etc. I remember there's a rhyme, a lullaby, a nursery lullaby I used to love as a child. It went something like, a cake is more useful than a pie. Tell me quickly before I cry. You know, those two lines contain a lot of information. The persona in the poem, a persona refers to the speaker, the voice that is in the poem. The persona seems to be addressing someone, not in an ordinary way, but is actually pleading. A cake is more useful than a pie. Tell me quickly before I cry. Notice the word pie and cry are rhyming words. We'll come to that when we're dealing with rhymes. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there are various forms of poetry that can be classified in different ways, depending on the cultural context in which the poem has been written, depending on the user, depending on the poet, depending on the style, and the stylistic features that the poet uses. Now, so for the purposes of our lessons, I would like us to concentrate on the three types of poems, the three major types of poems, which I've said are dramatic poems, lyrical poems, or narrative poems. Now, it is not always possible to make a distinction between them. For example, an epic poem can contain lyrical messages, or a lyrical poem can contain narrative parts. We shall come to that later. But generally, poetry uses a particular arrangement of words on the page to appeal to our sensory experiences of sight or touch to achieve a heightened emotional effect. That is very, very important. I'm going to repeat this, that poetry uses a particular arrangement of words on the page to appeal to our sensory experiences of sight or touch to achieve a heightened emotional effect. I remember there's a particular poem I really used to be fond of. It is called On the Beach. Oh no, I Met a Thief. It went something like, on the beach, on the coast, I met a thief who thought I had an innocent heart to steal. There's an element that immediately draws your mind to a beach. You begin imagining the calm waves or the large expanse of waters, the coconut palms, and then the soft sandy beaches. But the poet here meets somebody on the beach. And who is this somebody? Someone who thinks that he has a heart to steal. What does that bring to your imagination? Who steals hearts? Who would want to steal another's heart? Now, as we shall explore different ways of analyzing poems, we're going to find out exactly how poets string their words together, how poets use stylistic devices like imagery, personification, symbolism, similes in order to convey their meaning. So what I want you to remember is that poetry uses a particular arrangement. The specific arrangements of a poem determine its eventual meaning. So poetry uses a particular arrangement of words on the page to appeal to our sensory experiences of sight or touch to achieve that heightened emotional effects. In other words, when you're reading a poem, there has to be that emotional touch between you and the poet, or between you and the poem. You might wonder what is the purpose of poetry. That is simple: to convey information powerfully and beautifully. That is the whole essence of poetry. To convey information. The information can be about a particular experience, the information can be about a feeling, the information can be about any situation, but since poets do not use many words, since they compress a lot of meaning into a limited space or within a limited amount of words, they are able to achieve a powerful means and a beautiful means of conveying their meanings. So that is the whole purpose of poetry, to convey information powerfully and beautifully. Now, to make this clearer, let me use an analogy or an example of the study of mathematics. I know you're wondering what is the relationship. There is. The analogy is simply to make you see how the two are linked, or what kind of methods you can use in order to decipher, or in order to unfold, or in order to discover the meaning of a poem. Now, the purpose of the graph in maths is to convey information. And when a graph does this extremely well, it is arguably wonderfully done. Likewise, the purpose of a poem is to present emotions. Let me say that poetry is the art of writing emotions down. I think that explains it much more beautifully. When you feel emotionally moved, when you are inspired, and you want to put your emotions down in writing. I remember there was a lady, I had this over the BBC, who wrote a poem about her sister who died due to the corona pandemic that is presently affecting the whole world. And I was really touched. In fact, at some point, I almost shed tears when I listened to the words of the poem. I can't actually remember, but it was so beautifully written. And it had a refrain that my sister is not just a statistic. She was a human being. She had people she loved. She was loved by other people. My sister is not just a statistic, but a person who had respect, a person of integrity. It went something like that. So the words the poet used to pay tribute to her sister were so powerfully, and listening to them, this evoked an emotion in me. So when you're reading poetry, one thing you should be prepared to is to respond to a poem in a given emotional way. If you do not respond to poetry, then it means you're not comprehending the poem, you're not understanding what the poet is trying to describe to you. So poetry is a means of writing down emotions with the aim of making us feel better. Poetry can make you relive several experiences. Now, that is the whole essence of poetry. So, when we shall be looking at what poetry really means by analyzing specific types of poems, we are going to study the features, stylistic features used. We are going to look at the situations, the settings in which poets write their work, and actually lead you step by step on several ways that you can use to understand poetry. Now, I know this is a subject that, as I've already said, actually appears mysterious, it appears strange, but I want to make it so simple so that the more poems we shall be reading and discussing together, the more you will find it easy to understand poetry. One thing that is beautiful about poetry, however, is that the poet does not own the meaning of his poem. As many readers as there are in this world can find as many meanings as possible in a simple poem. So what you see in a poem, as long as you can justify it within the context of the poem, then you're right. Someone might see pain, someone might see despair, while someone else can see something else, depending on how you perceive the atmosphere, depending on how the mood and the tone of the poem affects you, you can arrive at a specific meaning, not by making assumptions, but by justifying the meaning you arrive at using situation, a specific context of the poem. Now, that is all we shall have for today. I was simply introducing myself by way of bringing my first lesson, and as I explained earlier on, this is a mode of instruction that we've not been used to. So the more lessons I give and the more feedbacks I get from you, I will be able, as a result of that, to modify my presentation, to modify my mode of delivery so that it is easily understandable. I know maybe has been a little bit rushed because it is the first one, but your feedback will determine how I conduct my lessons in future. Otherwise, tomorrow we are going to meet again and we will look at how poetry communicates. How does poems communicate to people? This will lead us into looking at certain aspects like stylistic devices, like rhythm, like rhyming, and that kind of thing. So if you've had anything from this, if you have a question that you'd like to put to me, please just go ahead and shoot it to me. I'll tell you how to send your questions to me. You can either use my email address or you can use a platform like Quora and post your question there. You can use, we can use Google Docs or we can use Slack. There are so many platforms that we'll use in order to interact both through the spoken media and through the written word so that our lessons become comprehensive. Otherwise, I am doing this for free. I'm not asking you for pay because during this time of the corona pandemic, we all have to come up together, do the much we can. When I had so many parents complaining about their kids' lack of guidance, while at home, I thought that, hey, I'm a tutor, I'm a teacher, why don't I use part of my spare time to give lessons that students can use, can download and use at home during their private times. Otherwise, this has not taken me more than 30 minutes. I believe this lesson has been shorter than that. Now, in my next lesson, because the introductory part will not be there, I'll make it specifically 1 hour. I'll try to repeat certain ideas and concepts. I'll try to explain these in detail so that you don't hang out there. You are not left behind. Otherwise, as for now, that is all I have for this evening. Bye-bye. Let's meet tomorrow. Thank you.